Hello, welcome to the podcast on public opinion. So, opinion has been something that's always been intertwined with the politics of a democracy like ours, because certainly representatives want to try to measure this public opinion. They want to do their jobs better by knowing what the citizens think. At least that's what we'd like them to do. Public opinion is defined as the sum of individual citizens' beliefs and attitudes about politics and public policies. And we often measure this with a rather imperfect tool called polls, Polls. And I call them imperfect because there are a lot of factors that can skew the numbers on a poll. On the other hand, that's not an excuse to dismiss them out of hand and say, well, all polls are inaccurate, so I'm going to ignore them, because that's certainly not true either. There's a middle ground. And there are a lot of professional organizations that do a great job of scientific polling, and you might have heard of companies like Gallup or Harris or Roper, and sometimes news organizations will often partner with other companies to do polls for their news reporting. The best polls do operate through a scientific method, and that means that it has to have a representative sample. Now that means that even if you only ask 1,000 people a single question, you want to make sure that that 1,000 people is as close as you can get in terms of demographics in the population. So that by that I mean gender, race, age, income, education, even geography. And you want to get this profile as close to the entire population as you can. Or if you can't get it that close, you might even weight the sample to make it look more like the population, the general population. You also want this sample to be a random sample. Random sample means that every person in the possible pool of respondents has an equal chance of being selected for the sample. So, for example, if you decided you would only select people in Humboldt County who happened to be passing by one corner on campus, well, there's some randomness to that, but not enough, right? Because you'll have a sample of almost all students, and you would expect that sample to be biased and not reflect the general community completely. So getting an unbiased sample is a bit of an art, and there are people in politics who will pay pollsters quite a bit of money to get a reliable poll with an unbiased sample. Now, one way to get around some of the bias that comes naturally with polling is to do many polls over time, and you ask the same question each time. That's called a tracking poll, and the one that typically we think of in politics is the one that measures the performance of an elected official. So the one we're all familiar with is one Gallup does to track American support for the president. And they ask something like, do you approve or disapprove of the way that Barack Obama is handling his job as president? So let's say you look at the latest poll, you see that President Obama in a recent week has about a 45% approval rate and a 48% disapproval rate. But then you see there's this thing called margin of error, sometimes abbreviated MOE, of plus or minus 3%. This is sometimes called the sampling error. What that means is that because we're only asking, let's say, 1,500 people and not the entire population of the United States, there's a possibility that the real number in the poll is in a range of 6 points with that number reported in the middle. So the real value of Obama's performance is somewhere between 48% and 42%. That's plus or minus on either side of 45. The real value of disapproval would be 51 and 45, which is plus or minus 3 points with 48 in the middle. So what does this all mean for you? It means you should be careful about reading short-term poll numbers that only fluctuate by a few points. If those points are within the margin of error, within that range I just mentioned, then you really can't distinguish real movement in the numbers and the public opinion from what we call statistical noise. So you really have to pay attention to that, and polls are really most useful if you look at them across long periods of time and when you can see long-term trends that go upward or downward and fall outside the margins of error. So don't be fooled by looking at a few numbers for a few weeks. They're usually not an indication of long-term movement. Polls can get other things wrong, especially if the framing of the question itself is biased, the words used in the questions. We call this question wording or framing effects. An example in your book was on a question about Obamacare rules for contraception coverage for religious institutions. And when you ask the question whether insurance plans of religious institutions should be required to cover contraception, at first 61% say yes, 31% say no. So that's pretty good if you support contraception coverage. But when the same poll actually included the wording opt out based on religious and moral objections within that question, then all of a sudden 57% agreed that institutions should not have to cover contraception, that they can opt out. So you have one question focused on women's health, another brought in the religious civil liberties. You get different answers to basically the same question. It's a fascinating effect that we see. Some polls are actually designed to be biased, and they're used, instead of to collect public opinion information, they're used as really political message transmission machines. These are called push polls. They seem like valid polls, but their actual purpose is to expose a person on the other end of a phone line to a specific message, especially if it's a negative message toward a candidate. And then you would encourage that person to think about the candidate in a new way. The book provides an example about John McCain in the 2000 presidential election, when you had a push poll in South Carolina that asked, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? And obviously this question was designed to, put this piece of information, false or not, into the heads of those who are hearing it. So I encourage you to, when you read any poll's results, to follow the links to the actual methodology of that poll now that you know something about it. You can see whether the poll is using scientific sampling methods or might be biased in one of the ways I described. There's a nice checklist in your book on page 178 that gives you a good idea of how to check a poll's accuracy. So what do we use polls for in politics? Well, they're used in many ways. They're something that news organizations report on. They're something that informs citizens on how other citizens near where they live are thinking. But it really serves an important function in representative democracy because politicians are looking at these numbers to indicate what policy changes could be successful in Congress. They might even pay their own money to commission specific polls for their districts. Here's an example. Some of you science majors might wonder why President Obama has not done more on global climate change. It's one thing he campaigned on. Well, look at the polls. In March 2013, the numbers on global climate change weren't so great. It found that 42% of a sample of adults nationwide believed that the Earth's average temperature is getting warmer due to human activity. 23% said it was just getting warmer, but it was due to natural patterns. 27% did not agree that we have global warming. 8% were unsure. So Obama is looking at these polls and wondering if he can push forward a policy without a majority of people even believing that human activity is part of the climate change problem. And that is probably one of the major reasons we haven't seen much movement in Congress, because the poll numbers just aren't strong enough. So it really does matter in what gets put on the agenda, on the legislative agenda. Well, how do people form these individual opinions that make up the collective feelings that we see in the poll numbers? It's a very complicated process, but we use this term political socialization as sort of an umbrella term. That's the process through which people learn about government and politics and form their opinions. So the research on this shows that there's a lot of different factors, and they most likely won't surprise you on how people form their opinions, their political opinions. Most important is family. Most young adults identify with the political party of their parents. unless they are consciously rejecting the parents' politics. So you have peers, you have school, the media, major life events. They all help shape our opinions. And there's typically some congruence between parents' beliefs and what we call socioeconomic status, say SES for short. SES is a person's age, race, or ethnicity, gender, religious identification, level of education, income, and even the region of the country in which you live. So these personal characteristics shape how you see the world, and it affects your vote choice. And vote choice, of course, is the most important political decision everyone makes regularly. And it's largely a function of each voter's SES and the party identification that person has. There's also other factors, evaluation of policy choices, and of course perceptions of the candidates. But your SES really does statistically determine a lot of things, including which party you might be most likely to identify with. Just take a look at page 184 in your book. There's a figure there of the 2012 presidential election. It's broken down according to each demographic group. You'll see how different the vote outcomes were for the two candidates when you separate the population or sort them by these demographic categories. Finally, let's talk about turnout, voter turnout. Because elections come down to those voters who actually bother to go vote or send in their mail vote, and we call this percentage voter turnout. And you might be surprised to read how low voter turnout actually is in this country. In presidential elections, it's hovered between 50 and 60% for the last 45 years. So you're talking about at least 40% of voters who are opting out of democracy each time we offer an election. It's pretty shocking. It's even more shocking when you consider that turnout is even lower during midterm congressional elections. It gets about 40% of eligible voters. And if you're going to talk about your age group, the 18 to 29-year-old age group, often only about 50% of eligible voters bother to turn out. And again, if you look at that figure 8.2 in your book about the election of 2012, you can see that Obama might have won this election because the groups that overwhelmingly vote for him, minorities, lower income, young voters, they all came out in numbers even more than people thought or had predicted. Even though these groups are typically the toughest voters to turn out, they have the lowest turnout rates. So, according to the Associated Press, if rates of turnout for minority groups had been the same in 2012 as in 2004, which they were pretty low in 2004, Mitt Romney would be president right now. One thing to ponder before I go, about voter turnout, which is, do you think we should be doing more to raise voter turnout, especially in groups where it's very low? Or is there a philosophy that says voters need to take individual responsibility to participate in democracy, and it's not the government's job to try to encourage these people to come out? It really should be their decision. Some might argue that including more voters who know very little about politics is not a great idea because they're not making the most informed decisions. So we should not spend resources on turning out traditionally underrepresented groups, especially because often these groups, as I mentioned, favor only one party, the Democrats. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next podcast.